LBR LBO Infrastructure Summit 2016.
My title is governance, and the good thing about governance is everybody is going to speak about governance, and certainly the three speakers before me talk about it. There are a few points that I would like to emphasize. If you look at approaching governance from an infrastructure point of view, I have put at a very broad level four areas, and these are some of the policy decisions that the government must take, that the people must take in encouraging rapid growth in infrastructure. I'm not going to elaborate too much on the slide, which is there. But if you sort of zero it down to governance in infrastructure projects, these are some other issues that I would like to highlight based on particularly the legal issues that we have faced both in and outside court. One of the key points is that it affects communities. So that's something that we need to keep in mind. It's a public good business that we are in. Sort of the discipline of the market economics that you might see in a normal private sector project, we might not see where there is a public element in it. And therefore, we need to be aware about the particular challenges that these projects would bring in terms of matching what we call government procedures, the governance procedures with the kind of private sector incentives if you are looking at private sector involvement. So these are some of the key things, again, at a very broad level, which I think should be taken into account in taking the decisions that you have to take in terms of infrastructure. Lakshmanan invited me to sort of propose, if possible, some sort of a governance framework. It's very, very difficult. But having worked particularly during the last couple of years in several sectors, including the road sector, I sort of developed this model where it's a cascading system. You need to get your laws and policies in right. And then you need to bring in the sector strategies. And from there, you get to the project level, decide on the mode of delivery, which the first speaker also referred to. And then, of course, you need to deal with the project implementation and the O&M, the 7 stage of the life cycle he referred to. The important thing is, the question we need to ask at this juncture in Sri Lanka's development is that, are we there yet? I think, in my personal opinion, that if you look at most of the infrastructure projects that took place in the past, one of the things that comes out where all of us can see a certain degree of good results is the road sector. Now, in the road sector, you begin to see these things happening. And interestingly, the particular legislation that deals with roads has a provision for public-private partnerships. And I believe that's one of the only or few legal instruments in Sri Lanka where there is a parliamentary recognized, a law-recognized framework inviting public-private partnerships. So once achieving this, we cannot forget, when you look at the past, where some of the projects got affected, particularly at implementation, the other mechanisms that make sure that these projects are sustainable, and that's the Director General from the PUCSL also referred to, is the social and environmental safeguards. And that's going to be key going forward, because I believe environment is going to be the most important aspect in the future. And you can see the world opinion is changing. The multilateral development agencies, there's a lot of emphasis on that. The third point on this slide is I've just borrowed the definition of good governance from the Asian Development Bank, where it says it's about accountability, participation, predictability, and transparency. Now, I know these are words that sound good, but if you actually deconstruct these words, what it really means is that if you can do your sector strategies, if you can do your national policies, if you can do your project selections, if you can do your project implementation, if you can do your beneficiary identification, respecting these 4 criteria, then the possibility of a project going wrong, the possibility of a project getting stopped halfway, the possibility of some sort of a judicial order coming in and stopping the project or ask them to change the project is minimum. So I'm sharing this with you because irrespective of which stakeholder you are, whether you are the government, whether you are an implementer, or whether you are a funder or a financier, it's important that all stakeholders who are concerned, who are involved in a project, give credence to these parameters before you finally decide to implement it. Having said that, coming back to the topic of today's concentration, which is the Megapolis challenges. Now, as you may be aware, Megapolis, we are approaching what we call a regional specific approach, where we have defined the region and then moving along with that. I heard a reference being made to Mahaweli as a successful project. If you think about it, In 1977-78, when we changed our economic policies and brought in free markets in a big way, we also had to invent a new set of institutions. And out of that, two that came out that was mentioned this morning is the Mahaweli Authority as well as the Urban Development Authority. Now, if you look at these authorities which I would call in 1978 had extraordinary powers, extraordinary mandates to implement some of the things that they were asked to do. And one of the speakers said Mahaweli was a successful project, and if you look at the way Mahaweli Authority is defined, and the way the whole Mahaweli project had been conceptualized in 1978, you would see that was a change in the way we used to provide infrastructure services before that. I think now, once again, Sri Lanka is again at that change stage, and we need to restart the thinking process, put on our thinking hats, and perhaps look at new ways to encourage and deliver infrastructure services. So these are some of the key areas which I feel that Megapolis as a region would face. One is our governance system. Whether we like it or not, we cannot ignore the constitutional frameworks, the devolution. So therefore, there'll be a lot of people who would say, look, this is my power area, you can't come, somebody else can't come into this. So we need to take that into account. And one of the biggest challenges I believe the legal draftsman is now facing is to look at implementation efficiency within this constitutional and the governance framework. Overlapping jurisdictions, it said, and also in the Western Megapolis region, we are going to have very powerful key players. So working through that power dynamics is going to be pretty critical. We need strategic alignment of incentives. We might not be in a position to take away some of the powers and sort of use the same thing as the Mahaweli Authority did in 1978, because the system has changed, system has matured. We fought a war for so many years, which was primarily based on more power to the regions and the local communities. So finally, one other thing that I would like to highlight before I move on is the question of land. Land is going to be critical. Sri Lanka is an island. Western region is where you will have I would say, most expensive parcels of land, very scattered. So it's going to be very, very critical as to how we are going to deal with lands in a way that balances development so that there won't be a net increase in poverty, which should be one of the key things in going forward. So what are some of the fresh perspectives, if I may use the word, that we looked at? I was involved in some of the discussions that went to the drafting of the Megapolis Authority bill, which is still in draft form. We are looking at a mega authority as an enabler. The key is to invite financing from other than budget resources, private sector investments, foreign investments, so that the money would be released for development in other parts of the country, because Megapolis, the Western Megapolis, is the key income generating region in the country. So we need to think about a long-term planning. Sri Lanka has been accused of having very short-term planning, a short-term perspective. So we need to look at that. We need to deal with what I call regulatory ratchet, where we just keep on passing laws and regulations, none of them get off the books, they just continue to be there. And as a result, if somebody is to want to put up a building, for example, I believe, you need to go through about 10, 12 types of approvals that you need to get. So you need to sort of smoothen out those things and then look at implementation. We have looked at strategic slicing in terms of area-based, sector-based, subject-based. Land, we are trying to introduce new things like negotiated settlement, land pooling schemes, very broad financing options. We need to be a lot more strategic in our procurement, not forgetting the allegations of bribery and corruption that we are facing in the past. So we need to look at a new way of doing it, faster, but also ensuring that accountability is there. We have the absolutely added advantage of data and information that we did not, for example, have in 1978. So we need to think about strategic use of that data, getting that information, and then making the kind of decisions that we are looking at. So from a governance point of view, the point I'm trying to make is it's something that the financiers and the private sector, for example, cannot afford to forget. You cannot take the point saying the government will look after it. If the cabinet has approved the project, we just need to implement it. No, it's a lot more, and you need to have a much broader stakeholder approach. And if you're looking at the kind of development, if you're looking at the kind of investments in the infrastructure, we need to get our governance framework right. And the governance framework, I encourage to be a very broad definition of it. I will leave you with this final thought. I think we need to start thinking that the government's duty is to steer and not to rule. It's just an enabler. Thank you.
LBR LBO Infrastructure Summit 2016.